Hello, and welcome to the West Hollywood Housing Element Update. We're going to give everyone a few moments to join us, and we'll be starting in about a minute. Thank you. Okay, thank you all. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us for the West Hollywood Housing Element Update webinar. A couple of ground rules on the next slide, just to set us all on the right path. All of you will be muted and your video display is disabled. We are recording this meeting and it will be publicly available on the project website. Also, all questions will be saved for the public record. We will have a few polling question opportunities that will appear throughout the presentation. We would love to have you engaged, and just so you know, all of these responses are anonymous. They're simply a tool to help us better understand who's joining us today. Participants can submit questions to the panel in the chat. You can access that chat below on the bottom of your screen, and we will address all questions at the end of the meeting. Next slide. My name is Allison Bartle. I'm with the Rent Stabilization and Housing Division. I'm joined today by my colleague, Rachel Diamond. She's the acting manager of long range planning. And we also have two individuals from Rincon Consultants who are leading our community outreach in our CEQA. Their names are Sarah Howland and Lexi Journey. Thank you. Next slide. So we're going to start off with an overview of what the housing element is. We'll go into the planning process. We'll also touch on the regional housing needs assessment. Then we'll review housing trends and needs in West Hollywood, some of our accomplishments, and the next steps. Next slide. We want to start off with our first poll to find out a little bit more about you. So you're going to see the poll is being activated now. You can go ahead and answer these 5 questions, and we'll give everyone about a minute to participate. Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like we have a lot of folks that live and work in West Hollywood on the call, mostly from the 90046 zip code, but also spread throughout the city. And we have various tenancy. Almost half of you have been here for more than 21 years, so that's great to see. And it looks like we have a lot of folks that are just getting their feet wet with the housing element. So we're excited to have you here and learn a little bit more about the housing element update process. So I'm going to turn it now over to my colleague, Rachel Diamond, in our next slide.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. As she said, my name is Rachel Diamond. I'm the acting long-range planning manager in planning and development services at the city. And right now, as you know, you are here, we are working on an update to our housing element. So we wanted to discuss with you what the housing element actually is. Next slide, please. So what is the housing element? The housing element is one of the pieces or elements, as they're called in California, to the city's general plan. And I think the best way to explain a general plan, is basically, I like to call it a book, but a multi-part guide to what we want to be in the future and how we're going to get there. So there are a number of elements that are required by state law, such as land use and safety and housing are three of those. There are seven that are required. The city has three additional elements to our housing element. But housing is one that is particularly unique in that the state requires that housing elements are updated every 8 years. This is more often than most of the other elements are required. So right now, our current housing element takes us through the end of this year. It was adopted unanimously by the City Council in 2012, and it was also approved by the California Housing and Community Development Department, who HCD, as they're more commonly called, and they are required to ultimately approve that housing element and make sure that it complies with all the requirements that state law provides for housing elements. So now we're back again, and this is the sixth cycle of the housing element. And this update will basically cover an 8-year planning period from 2021 through 2029. Next slide, please. So there are many things that the housing element does, but there are a few things that it does not do. The housing element, while it plans for where units will go in the city, it does not require the city to build the units that are planned in the housing element. So it may allow for projects to have a streamlined approval process in cities that haven't addressed their growth needs. But thus far, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the city has met our current growth projections for this current, what's called the RENA cycle, and we'll talk a little bit about that next cycle as well. Another thing the housing element does not do is provide funding. This is a huge one. The housing element will show us where we may be able to provide housing throughout the city to meet our requirements for state law, but it doesn't give us the money to do so. And so some of this work will be done by the city, but others will actually be done by developers and not actually controlled or funded by the city. But there is an opportunity for the city to apply for state housing funds and federal housing funds that allow us to do city-led projects. More specifically, it's some of the affordable housing projects that we see. The city is able to obtain funding and work with nonprofit developers to help make that happen. Another thing that the housing element does not do is actually authorize construction on the sites that are designated for new development of housing. So again, we have a very specific process, an entitlement process in our city, where most projects that probably are applicable to this would go to the Planning Commission and in some cases to the council. Those give us the ability to have a public hearing, to notify neighbors, and to have a real conversation about projects rather than streamline specifically and let anything in the housing element just be approved as is. This is really providing more of an overview concept for where units will go, but doesn't do things like design projects. Next slide, please. So as I stated earlier, the housing element needs to be adopted by the City Council. And then ultimately what we do is we send it off to HCD and then they certify the housing element. And that is a really essential step. The certification of the housing element essentially gives us the presumption that the housing element is legally adequate. And that's something that we can use in court should it be challenged. As shown here, if a court invalidated the housing element, it would suspend the city's authority to issue building permits on those sites. This does give us that cover that we've been certified by HCD. It also protects the city from litigation of the housing element. So you may have heard about some court cases that have come out of housing elements. One particular that comes to mind is Huntington Beach. That's something that is related to their not only not having an adequate housing element, but also not and continuing to block housing. So it wouldn't be something where if we didn't get this certified, we would immediately be sued, but it does assures the state that we are moving towards our housing goals and not directly opposing the construction and the planning of housing in our community. It does allow for us to have discretionary review over affordable housing projects. There are some limitations by state law of how much we can bring to a public hearing or have discretionary review over versus ministerial review would be something that would be reviewed over the counter and able to be approved without a public hearing. It allows us to maintain eligibility for state housing funds. This is a huge one. As I said, the housing element doesn't give us money, but the completion and the certification of an appropriate and legally adequate housing element will allow us to open the door for money to use for the construction of affordable housing. And that's a really big one. And then also, we don't face as much of the RHNA carryover into the next housing element cycle. And I'll explain that in a minute when I get into a little bit of what RHNA is, a regional housing needs assessment. Next slide. So the planning process, there are kind of 5 major components that we need to go through in order to actually do this housing element and ultimately have a final document that gets certified. The first is a review of accomplishments. Here's what we've done that in the past cycle that has worked and that has helped move us towards our housing goals. We then do a housing needs assessment, which effectively looks at what it is that we actually need in our community, followed by what are our constraints? What is limiting us from being able to plan for housing, entitle housing, and actually build housing in our community? This also includes an evaluation of the policies that we have in place. Do these policies actually help us build housing, or do these policies actually inhibit the ability to construct new affordable housing projects and market housing projects that have affordable housing in them? We then identify housing sites in the city that are adequate for the addition of new units. This is something that, based on the small size and the built out nature of our community, probably isn't changing too dramatically from our last housing element. We would continue to carry forward with a vast majority of those sites. And then from there, we kind of use those 4 components to then springboard into a strategy. How are we going to do this? And I think one of the things that we'll segue into with talking about the regional housing needs assessment is that the state and ultimately our regional council of government has allocated the city of West Hollywood over 3,900 units to be built in this next cycle. That doesn't exactly line up with the housing element time-wise, but is part of the process of the housing element. Next slide. So to talk further about the regional housing needs assessment, basically the state gave an overall determination. Within our state, we need this many units statewide. And then each region was given their own piece of that larger number. And then each region came up with their very specific methodology to divvy up that number. And so the city of West Hollywood effectively had a much larger number than in the past. And there's a number of factors that led to that. But ultimately, now that we have, right now it's a draft number from the state pending final appeals of other communities' final allocation. Once we have that final number, the housing element will need to reflect the ability to build those number of units on those available sites. So again, we'll be planning for those units, but it doesn't necessarily create the push the actual construction of those units. Next page. So this gives you a breakdown of the city's 2014 through 2021 RHNA progress. So this is our current cycle, and our number for this current cycle was 77 units. Extremely low. And it was low because when they were studying the economy and the housing situation to create those numbers, it was right in the middle of a pretty severe economic downturn in California and nationwide. So as those numbers got developed, they really reflected a very low number and perhaps not the overall need of the region. Ultimately, we were able to approve 2,259 units, and these are actually slightly old numbers in terms of, I think, not reflecting the past, I believe, 6 months of data. So we'll see that by the end of this cycle, by the end of 2021, we would be able to, and I believe it's through October, we would be able to increase these numbers even more. That's quite a large overage of over 2,000 units. Next slide. As we kind of alluded to before, there has been a massive housing crisis in California. There's a declared statewide housing crisis. This has led to increased housing costs with the statewide median home costs at 2 times the national median. We have an estimated shortage of 3 million units in the state of California. And 1.3 million of those units would be accounted for lower income rental households who need affordable homes. So there's 1.3 million households that are not able to find housing within their affordability level. And so as a result, 8 out of 10 low income households spend at least 50% of their income on housing. And frankly, I think you see that across, not only low income, but moderate income as well, that in California, people are spending a very large portion of their, monthly budget on housing. And that creates an imbalance, among many industries. And so in order to deal with this housing crisis, and again, in following the state's continued efforts to have a regional housing needs assessment allocation that helps address this. Next slide. There have been a number of changes to state legislation to address that. In 2017, there was a huge housing package, including SB 35, that allowed for certain streamlining of projects when you don't meet your RENA your allocation for the last cycle. So for example, right now we've met our allocation for this cycle, so that should carry forward. But what it does for some communities is that if you haven't met your allocation, which almost all communities in California have not, I believe the number is still around 20 communities in the state have met their allocation thus far for this current cycle. If you haven't, that there are certain types of projects that are streamlined, meaning they don't have to go through an arduous development review process in order to be built. And so that's a big change for a lot of communities because they're losing some of their local control. In the city of West Hollywood, because we have met that, we haven't been subject to that, but it's certainly something that could impact us in the future. There's also a number of changes to housing element law and then fines for violating the Housing Accountability Act, which basically limits the ability for cities to deny projects that include housing, except under a very narrow scope. And that's something that unfortunately has been happening in a number of communities, not West Hollywood, where the communities have ignored state law and have denied projects or put up barriers to housing. In our community, I think that we are extremely lucky to find that balance of being able to bring projects through the development review process while still meeting, again, our general plan goals. And that's something that we still want to continue to do. In 2018, there was a number of legislation, particularly related to the RENA process, as we started to gear up for this time where we were going to have a new RENA process, a new allocation. And basically, there were changes to the process to try to make it more objective. And I think one specific major change for us is adding affirmatively furthering fair housing to the way that the methodology got calculated. So that was something that was included in the way that they evaluated each community to determine their RENA allocation. Next slide. So now here we are. This is the draft RENA allocation for 2021 through 29. And I think it's worth noting the breakdown of the very low, low, moderate, and then more than moderate would be standard market rate units for a total of 3,924 units. This was quite a shock to the city in that it is 50 times our allocation for the last cycle. But this is, I would say, fairly, mirrors the big change that we see in every community across the board. It certainly provides more density for West Hollywood, but the breakdown of units is interesting in that we do have a skew towards the affordable units, which isn't typically what we see in a standard project. So we will need to look at our policies to see how we can make this work and create an environment that helps us to facilitate the construction of these affordable housing units. Next slide. So there were a number of steps that were already taken thus far in the planning process. As far as RHNA, as many of you may know, the city had elected to appeal our RHNA allocation, but ultimately the city council rescinded that appeal. So right now what's happening is all of the other communities in our 7-county region are in the process of occurring. So we have appeal hearings that are starting, I believe started last week and will continue through February. And once those appeal hearings are done and determinations are made, then we'll get a final RHNA allocation. And to explain why it might change is because we have a total number that we need to meet. And so the total number, if one community's number goes down because of their appeal, then someone else's number has to go up. And so that will be recalculated using the methodology, and depending on how big of a change that is, there's different methods for recalculating. And like I said, in February we'll get that final number. The city also went ahead and created a housing element task force. 10 members were appointed to the council at the December 21st hearing, and basically that task force includes housing experts that will meet and review the existing housing element goals and provide feedback on the next cycle's goals. So that's something that I think is in concert with community meetings like this, where we want to make sure that anyone can be involved in the process. So I really want to thank everyone for your participation today. I'm sure you're all very busy. Next slide, please. And with that, I think we're going to open it up to a quick poll for everyone to ask you about the housing that you live in, and then I'll turn it back over to Allison. Thanks so much.
Great. So we'll leave this poll open for about a minute, and it would be great if we could have your responses.
I did just want to jump in. I know we did have a question. We're going to have question and answers at the end. I appreciate the question that did come in. So if there are any other questions, we can certainly take those at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I see that there are about 5 in the Q&A. So just keep in mind that we are aware of your questions, and we're just going to hold until the end and go through them. But again, please keep them coming, and we're happy to respond. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll. It looks like the majority of folks on our call live in apartments within the city or outside the city, but it seems like most of us are in the city of West Hollywood. Most are renters, and most speak English at home. We've got a wide age range and similar to our annual household income. So we appreciate that and for participating. I'm going to go into a little bit of the next slide, an overview of the housing trends and needs specific to West Hollywood. Next slide. So we know that West Hollywood is different than surrounding LA for a number of reasons. We know that we have a higher number of seniors. We have a higher number of LGBTQ plus identifying individuals. We know that we have a much higher Russian speaking and former USSR immigrant community. We know that about 80% of West Hollywood is a renter versus about 50% in surrounding LA County. And we know that we have a lot of single person households and residents living alone. Next slide. We also know that, while West Hollywood is known as a great place to go out and to be seen, and we have a lot of high income earners, we also know that about 50% is low or very low income. So with that in mind, what makes us unique is also how we've tried to frame our housing programs. And if we go to the next slide, a quick overview of our current housing element goals. So, the goal in our last cycle and really in all cycles is we were trying to achieve equity through inclusion and affordable housing and rental protections. And so from our last cycle of the housing element, our 6 goals were affordable rental housing, maintaining and improving housing in neighborhoods, diverse housing addressing all socioeconomic needs, adequate opportunities for new housing, maintaining current housing while also creating new housing, and equal access to housing for all. And so on the next slide, I'm going to go through some of our housing accomplishments and how we're able to create and maintain housing. Next slide. So in the next several slides, I'm going to go over the city's 2 primary housing programs. I'm also going to go over our affordable housing projects that we funded in the city. I'm going to go through our adopted policies and then some of our special studies and initiatives. Next slide. There are really, in order to create housing in the city of West Hollywood, these are our 4 main tools to create housing. So our inclusionary policy in the city of West Hollywood is any building any multifamily building rather, that has 10 or more units, 20% of the units in that building have to be on site and set aside for affordable housing. And our city code requires that we alternate low and moderate units within that 20% set aside. Another tool that we have is we have our affordable housing that's 100% affordable buildings. And those would be our senior and special needs housings that are largely funded through partnerships with nonprofit housing providers. An example would be our projects that we fund through West Hollywood Housing Corporation or through EAH Housing. We also have an in lieu fee. So if you have 10 or less units in your multifamily building, you can either choose to build the units on site, or you can pay into an in lieu fee in lieu of providing the housing on site. And that goes into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we can then use that money to give back to nonprofits in order to construct new housing. We also have a commercial impact fee. So we know that our commercial properties in West Hollywood, they require individuals to staff it. And in order to have our workers be able to live in West Hollywood, we know that we need to be able to offset that cost. So any building 10,000 square feet or greater has to pay a per square foot fee into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund to offset that. And that's our commercial impact fee. Next slide. So again, as I said, the in lieu fees go into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And currently about 75% of new projects choose to pay the in lieu fee rather than building the units on site. We then again use that money to fund nonprofits to build affordable buildings for us within the city. And in 2020, our most recent project was with EAH Housing, and we helped them acquire the site at 1041 through 1049 Martel. Next slide. Other 2 projects, recent projects, both of the first one, Blue Hibiscus, which was with West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation. This is on the east side of West Hollywood on Detroit. It's 22 units. It's for low and extremely low income. It's transition to age youth and people with disabilities, including HIV. We also funded for the first time a project outside of the boundaries of West Hollywood. You might have seen this project. It's part of the very large LA LGBT Center expansion. And the first phase of the project is already completed. It was for transition to age youth. The second phase is for seniors, and we put in enough money to set aside 13 units that will be leased up in 2021, likely in the next 6 months, for seniors that live and are on our inclusionary housing list. They'll be provided housing in that building. Next slide. So as you can see, there are really 5 different pools of affordable housing within West Hollywood. We have close to 1,000 units in the pipeline or already constructed in the affordable nonprofit, so our 100% affordable buildings, and also with our inclusionary program. So those are our units that are within market rate buildings. So you don't see them, they're distributed within a market rate project. We also have 366 units with the county, and it's a county HUD joint program. We have 150 units at 1222 Fairfax, which are Section 8 units. And then we have 710 units in our larger Section 8 program spread throughout the city. Next slide. So then the second thing I wanted to talk about, in addition to creating housing, we know that we also need to maintain our existing housing and protect our existing housing. So our rent stabilization program is one of the vanguards in the state and in the country. Since 1985, our rent stabilization ordinance has provided limits on rent increases and protections to tenants that live in West Hollywood. And the majority of our buildings in West Hollywood are rent stabilized. So a rent stabilized building is any building built prior to July 2nd, 1979. And then again, that's about 70% of the housing stock in West Hollywood falls under our RSO, our rent stabilization ordinance. As many of you might know, because you may live in a rent stabilized building, the initial rent is market rate. Where the protections come in is once you've stayed in your unit. And so your rent increases are capped every year, and the city calculates the AGA each year by looking at 0.75 of the consumer price index, which is tied to inflation. And we announce that. And so, for example, this year, the rent increase from September 1 through August 31 of this year is 0.75, as an example. And so, we know that the rent stabilization does provide protections to folks that already live in West Hollywood. And you can see here, if you look at a one-bedroom apartment, the rent prior to 1996 is $996, whereas the 2019 new tenancy rent is over $2,000. So we know that it only, helps those that already are in rent stabilized housing, but it does provide limits and protections for those tenants. Next slide. Great. So as we discussed earlier, we know that nearly half of West Hollywood residents, renters, are rent burdened, meaning that they're paying 30% or more of their income towards their rent. And we also know that, a number of our tenancies turn over, and when the rents turn over, they go back to market rate. So you can see from 2019, we had over 1,300 turnovers, most of them in the one-bedroom housing category. Next slide. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight with these two programs, as you can see, it's spread out throughout the city. So the light blue is all of our units that are protected by the RSO, and more concentrated on the east side and central, but it's spread throughout the city. Also in the darker blue, those are our buildings where we have 100% affordable units. And the goal in our city, in terms of affordably furthering fair housing, is to spread those throughout the city and make sure that we're not concentrating our affordable housing projects in one area of the community, but rather spreading them throughout. Next slide. In addition, we have other programs. So our division is made up of rent stabilization and housing, strategic initiatives, and social services. And all of these divisions together are protecting tenants and have various programs to make sure that we can keep folks housed. Some of the special studies that we've done in this last cycle was analyzing how to best utilize county and state affordable housing funding sources. We're also in the middle of pilot programs, which we'll be coming back to council with this year. And these are new and innovative ways to make sure that we increase housing opportunities in the city. And we're also exploring a possible program to provide tenants the first right to make an offer if their landlord is planning to sell. Next slide. So we also wanted to highlight the next steps. We're going to be releasing, and I'm going to be putting it in the chat right now, a survey to find out more from you about the housing programs that are working and what you would like to see in the next round of housing updates. And if you look in the chat, a link will be provided there. We're also, on the next slide, I'll point you towards the website where all things related to this housing element update will be listed. We are in the process right now of getting community feedback. And then we're going to take our community feedback from both the general public and from our task force and put together the draft of our next housing element. That will then go under secret review for the environmental impact of the draft report. Then the public will review it again. We'll send it to the state for review, and then we'll have a public hearing and adoption prior to October 15th of 2021. And then we'll submit to HCD, the state, for submittal and certification. On the next slide, we've got a rough schedule. We will be going to Planning Commission. We'll be going to our task force. We'll be coming back to you. And the goal then is by October 15th of this year, we will have a certified housing element so that we stay in compliance for all the reasons that Rachel went over of the importance of staying in compliance with the state. And then next slide, the housing element website, weho.org/housing element. On this site, you can take the survey. You can also sign up at the bottom for updates. So anytime that we update the website or we have upcoming events, you'll be notified. You can also read there's also a number of documents available if you want to read our previous housing element and all of our annual progress reports that we send to the state to find out more about housing production within the state. Those can all be found there. And then next, we're going to turn it over to you. So I know that I can see that the chat and the Q&A have been buzzing. And so Lexi and Sarah, could you give us a couple of questions, and Rachel, we will do our best to answer them or to direct you to resources to help you out.
Great, thank you, Allison. So as you mentioned, there are quite a few questions, so I will go through patiently first with the chat and then the Q&A. If there's any additional questions, please keep adding them. The first question, are ADUs and JADUs counted in the statistics, or are those numbers outside the development numbers being considered in this process?
I can take that one. They are being counted. So any new accessory dwelling unit or junior accessory dwelling unit is going to count towards our overall development of housing units for this next cycle.
And they count, we send annual reports to the state. And I believe it was about 3 years ago, they specifically asked us to start pulling out ADUs, and we separately report on ADU production. And again, those annual reports to the state are available on weho.org/housing element. You can review all of our annual updates on ADU production and general production that we report.
Mm-hmm. And someone asked the great question of what the acronym ADU stands for, of an accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah, so these are accessory dwelling unit. They're oftentimes called granny flats, backyard homes. These are additional units on the site that are separate housing units.
Great. Other question of, I know that West Hollywood does a lot for the artist community. Is there any thoughts on using an empty space for studio spaces as well?
I can address this. So there are definitely some other plans that are happening at the same time as this, and the city has an arts plan that speaks directly to the use of certain spaces to help provide studios. As far as live work type spaces, that's a policy that the city has been evaluating and amending over time to try to incentivize people to have live work spaces. Right now, those units in the city of West Hollywood are considered commercial spaces. And so there is a slight disconnect from the RENA allocation, but it's certainly something that the city wants to promote and wants, to have more artists in the community. As far as vacant storefronts, we haven't necessarily gotten that far in terms of how to deal with our current situation, but that's certainly something that we're starting to really address.
And we received a comment about the not stop using the acronyms. We'll work on that. Apologies for that. Sometimes it's just the typical jargon. There was a question of, I am a homeowner for 30 plus years in West Hollywood. I looked at the staff report, but I'm requesting a simple list of each committee member, how they were named, appointed, and who they represent, please.
That's certainly something that we can provide. I don't have that list in front of me at the moment, but we can provide everyone with the list of names and who the council appointment came from. Each council member appointed 2 people, and then we do have some short bios on each person that we can provide on our website after this meeting. And again, it's weho.org/housing element.
Yes, and we've put the couple of links in there for the survey link as well as the website. Okay, and now going to the question and answer section. In the notice about this session, it states the housing element is a state mandated component for the City of West Hollywood's general plan that must be updated every 8 years. The housing element serves as a policy guide that provides an indication of the need for housing in the community, particularly the availability, affordability, and adequacy of housing. So their question is, while West Hollywood has changed rather dramatically, why does there not seem to be little or any housing development in Carmel or Santa Barbara? How are they able to remain somewhat static? It's confusing. Please explain. So we'll do an answer live.
I can take this one. I mean, while we're not, I won't get into the very specifics about Carmel or Santa Barbara. I think there are a number of components that result in communities not building a lot of housing. I think in a lot of cases, communities, one, have a lot of community opposition to growth that ends up in public hearings, and that influences public officials to deny projects or to discourage projects from coming in, some of which can be in opposition to state laws that don't really allow us to deny projects. There are many communities that have a hostile entitlement process. And again, I'm not speaking to Carmel, I'm not speaking to Santa Barbara, but communities that are literally the opposite of ours, where we have an environment of welcoming all of our community into our office to help them with whatever issue it is. And for developers, that means helping them through the process. And we have a planning commission and a city council that understand the need to evaluate projects based on the allowable parameters within state law. And again, some communities don't necessarily follow that. There are other limitations like the cost of land and the cost of construction, and that ranges through a number of communities and throughout the different regions of California. Obviously, we have a very different basis for construction than you might in, let's say, Eureka, California, for example. And so, one of the things that I think is really important to note is what makes us open to the development that we've had. And it's been having a solid general plan and having a housing element that was certified in the past and moving forward that helps us create an environment that allows for development within those parameters.
Another question we have was, did you see the article in the LA Times about Treehouse, a community shared living development?
I can answer this question. So that's a co-living project. Thus far in the city of West Hollywood, we have not approved any co-living projects. We have 2 developers that have come forward and proposed co-living. They have not yet gone to planning commission, so it's not yet in the public record. But the city does not have, various council members have listed their stances on co-living, and that's on the public record. We are open to co-living projects. It's just getting it through the entitlement project through the entitlement process is, somewhat cumbersome because they don't quite fit in everyone's development standards. But we're aware of co-living, and it was explored as a potential pilot program in the city of West Hollywood, along with micro units. It's an interesting project. So yes, we are aware, and it may or may not be coming to West Hollywood, depending how it proceeds in planning commission. Thank you.
I did want to add one additional piece, which is that when you look at the number of units that we construct, a studio apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment, a 4-bedroom single family home, and a 30-bedroom co-living unit are all considered the same one unit. There may be different levels of affordability, putting them in different categories, but I do want to note that you could have 40 people living in, what feels like a 40-room space, but it really is one unit when it comes down to what the state views. So just, I think, an interesting aspect of that.
So the next question is, there a count for how many households/units were displaced by the new development project in West Hollywood?
Yeah, so I was looking at those, pulling up our most recent numbers. So our numbers go since 1986, we began tracking displacement. And I believe there are 234 properties. In those 234, 892 units have been removed through the Ellis Act. And so that's what we tracked. So those folks would be displaced due to development. And we do provide priority to displaced residents, and we do, an incredible job of relocating into new housing our displaced residents, and it is a priority for the city. But so it's approximately 900, close to 900 since 1986.
Thank you. Next question is, when the two houses adjacent to the Gelsons,
Yep.
thank you, were designated for demolition, some opponents wanted the city to construct an affordable building. Then Councilmember John Hellman said that if the city did not own those two lots, the city would do that. The city has owned the lot at the southwest corner of Santa Monica Boulevard and Crescent Heights for many years. Some ideas promoted have been for a park, or worse, a parking lot. Why has this not been utilized by the city to construct a mixed-use building? The need is desired. Why has the city not done this? So it's for that particular lot of Santa Monica Boulevard and Crescent Heights.
Rachel, I can jump in.
Sure, go ahead.
We are aware, there are many factors at play. And so the city, is very much pushing for the development of that site, and it's in the works. In terms of what's public right now, I think it's still forthcoming, but we are aware of the need. And part of our update with the housing element is to identify potential sites for housing. And that site is certainly, a site that we've identified for housing. And so it's on our radar, and we would very much love to see housing there. And it's, various factors within the city have other plans. And so it's just understanding the needs and, moving forward with a project that best fits the community's desires.
Great, thank you, Allison. I noticed there is a comment about panelists adding our job titles to our names. We also have our job titles on the PowerPoint, and as we'll be sharing this recording as well as the PowerPoint on the project website, if there is any confusion or want to look back at numbers, that is available to you. Also, if there are specific numbers, whether it be for the regional housing needs assessment or another piece of information, please feel free to chat. I'm happy to reshare the PowerPoint and provide that extra information. The next specific question was, it seems that West Hollywood issues permits primarily on luxury housing with 20% low income. Where are the new units for moderate income and workhouse renters?
I can answer this question. That's a great question. Thank you. And what the city does is they regulate the amount of units that are affordable, and that's it. So we don't say you can then build luxury housing, but the city regulations allow for market rate housing, and with that 20% requirement. The city has been working on updating our inclusionary requirements, as well as looking at what we call, kind of moderate plus. We have a moderate income housing requirement. So in that 20% low income, it's actually, you're doing 10% very low income units and 10% of the units for what we call moderate income households that are actually at or slightly above average median income for the region. But we're looking at updating our policies to have more units allocated for what we call moderate plus, which really reflects that kind of worker in West Hollywood that's slightly above the average median income, and so doesn't necessarily qualify for those lower income units. And this is exactly what this process is for, to address some of these things as well. So I appreciate that question.
Great, thank you. And we've had a couple of comments that I will bring into this, going back a little bit for that Crescent Heights property, just to keep everyone informed that we have received your comments. It's been said that Crescent Heights and Santa Monica Boulevard has a toxic flume under the land and is too expensive to clean up. Could the city require moderate housing?
There are definitely some environmental concerns with that site that have been, I think, addressed as part of the, and will be addressed in the future should there be development in EIR or environmental impact report. Thank you for saying stop using the acronyms. It's very difficult sometimes. And so that is something that we will be addressing. What was the second part of the question?
So it was, could the city require moderate housing? And then Allison provided some information on median income. Thank you.
As far as moderate housing on that site, certainly that could be part of the development of that site. Could the city require moderate housing as part of our current overall projects? We do. So in that 20% of affordable units, they're 10% very low income and then 10% moderate income. And again, we're working on kind of evaluating how to expand that further to kind of a next step. One of the biggest barriers to building that next step is that there's no public funding for those types of units. So also trying to help understand how those types of units can be constructed with outside funding as well.
And also the question of, please explain what the planning department defines as affordable.
Do you want to take that, Allison?
Yeah, so again, I'm happy to point you towards we calculate this based on median income. So again, affordable would be, in general, your housing is affordable if you're spending 30% or less of your income on your housing. So that's a general affordability term. In addition, to be part of our inclusionary housing program, where the rents are fixed, you would need to be making, a one-person household would need to make $768 or less to qualify for the moderate unit. To qualify for a low income, very low unit, if you are a one-person household, you would need to be making 50% of that, which would be $33,384. So for a one-person household, as an example, between $33,384 and $66,768, that's the bandwidth of income that our affordable housing program is designed to create housing for. But in general, when we're talking about affordable housing at all income levels, we're asking that you should be paying no more than 30% of your income towards your rent.
Great. And thank you also for all these questions. We're still going to make some progress through this. Next question I have in the Q&A is, earlier the city and a developer were in a disagreement with the terminology of housing unit, and the city expressed concern whether or not the developer had appropriated the correct number of affordable/low income units and were appropriately marketing their availability, as well as questioning how all of their units occurred in general. Will you please review that case, the outcome, and what the city has in place to help enforce developers, to ensure that developers are working with community city to fairly market and fill affordable housing units? Is there any incentive should developers choose to allocate more affordable housing? So that's
I think we can answer this a bit offline. It sounds pretty specific to this project, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Again, all units in our affordable program are filled through our inclusionary housing waitlist, and so we open the waitlist periodically. There are currently, it was most recently opened in November of 2019. There are approximately 5,000 people, households rather, on our list. And we fill them through sorting through that list based on the time that they joined the list. The average wait time is 10 years to go from signing into the wait list, joining the wait list, and receiving housing. So, and I'm happy to this individual to reach out to me personally and answer any questions you might have on that specific project. But since we are limited on time, I'd like to move through to our next question.
Great. Thank you, Allison. So due to COVID-19, many people have been unable to pay their rent. Those monies will eventually come due. One current report indicates that there could be an 84% increase in homelessness in the Los Angeles area, which of course includes West Hollywood. How is the city preparing for a possible worst case scenario as regards to the homelessness increase? And how can we help to house them or at least assist them?
Yeah, so I think, you want to go ahead,
Rachel.
Allison?
No, you.
So, I think, the city has specifically stepped in pretty considerably with our own rent assistance program. And we've been able to reach a large number of people in our community to provide, what isn't a complete solution, but definitely some assistance to help people get through this really, really difficult time. As staff, it's hard not to feel very emotional about this because I just even reading the question, I think it can be really upsetting, and to see an 84% increase in homelessness in our entire region when we're already feeling it, this problem being extremely overwhelming and people experiencing homelessness are increasing in numbers. And so, the county has done quite a bit to begin addressing this, and the city itself has been addressing this with our own specific contracts with social services groups to help address our homelessness needs in the community. We will continue to do that the same that we have been doing, and help reaching out directly to people that are experiencing homelessness on our streets in our community. We're really trying to get to people before they get to that place, to give them the assistance they need to avoid that situation. So, we're continuing to develop programs. I think as more money becomes available to our community, potentially this week, we are working tirelessly to get access to those funds to use specifically to help address some of these issues and to help our community members through this really tough time. And if anyone needs assistance or has questions about that, please reach out to our housing division. They can help you. There is help available. We want to help you, and we're here to help you deal with your landlords as well.
Great, thank you. Next question is, would it be possible when constructing 150 units to build 3 levels luxury, moderate, and low income?
So again, in our market rate projects, a 150 unit project would likely utilize a density bonus. And so again, 20% could be affordable. Our current, code is 20% would be set aside for affordable in that building. And that would be evenly split 10% low, 10% moderate. Certainly those numbers could increase, but that would be a change in code. And also important to keep in mind that we have to bear the opportunity cost of making sure development happens. If your inclusionary is too constraining, then you have a decrease in development, which ultimately leads to fewer units being produced. So it's a careful balance of figuring out that appropriate percent in order to allow development to not be stalled, but also allow the community to have opportunities to have moderate and low income folks stay in housing in that community. Next question. Great.
So the next question is more of just a comment for trying to diversify our times for meetings, one during the day and one in the evening. We are definitely working with COVID constraints, and the commenter even said they work for a city, they completely understand. We are trying to make the balance, once again, of the project website, being able to have all this information on there. Our survey is very well in-depth comments and question opportunities. So thank you for that. For the meeting times, we'll try and accommodate that for the next meeting. But also letting you know that there are a lot of opportunities on the project website and the survey. The next question is, do you work with WehoHRS? I don't seem to be able to reach anyone there when I call or email unless I CC council members. I'm waitlisted and it seems stuck, not moving. Can you speak about this inclusionary housing program?
Yeah, so just to reiterate, there's 5,000 people on the list and the average wait time is 10 years. That being said, we have an information coordinator on duty at all times. Just to repeat, that phone number to reach them, 8 to 5 is 323-848-6450. I can also put that in the chat in a second. And you can also email them at rsh@weho.org and they'll get back to you. We can't move development ahead though. So until there are available units, you're not going to see a lot of movement on the list. And again, I'll put the phone number and the contact info into the chat right now as we go on to the next question.
Great, thank you, Allison. And another question is, does the city plan to revise the income data based upon the fact that many incomes have decreased due to COVID? affordable based upon old data is not necessarily affordable today.
Yeah, I can answer.
Absolutely. Oh, go
Sorry.
ahead.
So we take LA County, so we do revise it every year. So it won't be revised until we go to council in April, and so it will be revised next June. But our data shifts every year based on LA County median incomes, and so we are aware of the shifting, and we take that into account every year.
Great. Next question, 11 units of low-income housing was demolished on Detroit to build Blue Hibiscus. Didn't that make it more pricey to the net 11 units?
Absolutely.
I can take this.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. I just wanted to, I know we have generally the same answer that yes, these units were really expensive to construct. I will say that state law has changed since then that basically that would have allowed this project in particular to have additional units on site. And so if it was built in today's environment, we may have a different outcome in terms of how expensive it was to generate each of those units. So that's something that, I think we'll see a big change when we have our next 100% affordable housing project.
Yeah, and you see that in general, the shifts. I mean, we're really looking at a minimum for our new project sites to be 40 units or greater. You really find the sweet spot in terms of pricing, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but around 50 units. So you really see the cost per unit decline. And also it's 50 units of housing on 2 or 3 parcels instead of 22. So absolutely, we wanted that project to be bigger. And, going forward, and the changes will allow us to build larger projects and house more people. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Next question is, can you clarify how many or the percent of total units in the city that are currently set aside for low or very low income?
No, I mean, it's difficult to answer that question. If you want to go back and review the slide where we kind of parcel out our Section 8 program and our inclusionary program, I think it's important that in new projects, 20% is set aside for affordable and 10% is low, very low in new projects, and 10% is mod. So those are the rough stats.
Great, thank you. The California Senate, House, and governorship are all controlled by Democrats with a supermajority. Why has there been no concentrated effort to repeal the truly evil Ellis Act, as well as the Costa-Hawkins? So any repeal of the Ellis Act and the Costa-Hawkins?
I mean, we have our legislative team tracking this, and I can't say that Rachel and I have any more insight than you in terms of what the legislative bodies will do. But we're certainly watching.
Currently, 70% of the housing stock is rent stabilized. What is the annual trend over the past 5 years? Is the percent going up or down? Is there a target percent in the housing element for rent stabilized?
It's generally been holding steady if you look at our time over time, and certainly it's something to consider as we look at our policies and goals for the next housing element. I think that's a great suggestion.
Will the city consider changing the rent stabilized threshold to later than 1979 for building to be rent stabilized?
So due to Costa-Hawkins, we are limited in the changes that we can make in terms of our rent stabilization program. So, pending a change in Costa-Hawkins, that as the previous question about the supermajority, maybe, we don't know, but certainly something to think about.
The next question is, West Hollywood is one of the densest cities in the country. What is the population goal?
So rather than having goals, we have projections. So we don't necessarily have a goal of this is how many people we want to live in our city, but we understand the reality of as we grow denser, that there may be more people. What we have been seeing is somewhat of a steady population in West Hollywood, because even as we build more units, our average household size is actually getting smaller. So less people are living in each unit, some of which may be a result of studios being constructed, but also that we have less large households than maybe a lot of other communities based on our demographics. So again, there isn't a specific goal except to understand as we move forward and as we build more units, what that does to our population.
Next question is infrastructure and climate change being considered while building another 4,000 units in 1.89 square miles?
Yeah, so they are. And the housing element specifically doesn't delve extremely deeply into those topics, but we absolutely have different elements of the general plan that also address those things and will be adjusted over time to address this increase in units. Right now, we're in the process of working on an update to the climate action and adaptation plan, which will address, what happens when we have more units, what happens to our infrastructure, and then also our other elements address that as well. Additionally, the CEQA process allows for some analysis of those two issues when you look at new development projects individually. Thanks.
Great. So this next question is a multiple part question, so I'll break it up a little bit. Understanding that housing, especially in the last decade, as homelessness steadily rose, has multi-project developers looked at the possibility of the feasibility of an incentive such as first development build more than affordable housing than 20%, therefore more people in need are housed first. Or an incentive towards the next program in which the cost of land, if city owned, is discounted, but developer can build more regular housing to make up for the shortfall for the first development. And the need will be to help first project be sustainable without putting the affordable housing friendly developer out of business before the second developer is on the ground.
I'll just jump in and say there was a change to state law that somewhat addresses this. I mean, we've certainly thought about the kind of shifting of projects. We certainly have considered some of these things, but I think one thing to bring up about state law is that developers can build a project and then actually put their affordable housing onto another site. And also put more affordable housing into one project and have it count towards another. So there is the ability to shuffle a little bit by state law. And what you're describing is something we can absolutely look at as we move forward in addressing what our policy is and how our policies can change to address our housing crisis and ultimately update the housing element. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those ideas and for the comments also, Rachel. Why are West Hollywood's regional housing needs assessment numbers so very high? We have 19,000 people per square mile already. I think we've already started to address that, but if we want to just follow up.
Sure. So the methodology is based on a number of aspects of a community, but I think there are two very key things that create a very high regional housing needs assessment allocation for West Hollywood itself. And that is proximity to jobs and proximity to transit. And those are two very big components of the equation to get to your number. And we are a job center. We are a place where people go to work. And part of the methodology is to house people where they work so that we also deal with some of the climate issues in terms of transportation impacts to the environment. So the other being our proximity to high quality transit, in which basically the entire city of West Hollywood falls into that category of high quality transit area, which again increases our numbers because we want people to be able to take public transportation from their home to their job and vice versa.
Great, thank you. And a question of, does the city have a code for co-living projects? I know we mentioned co-living projects, but nothing was mentioned of the code.
Not really. So it's something that we're looking at, but we basically would fit a co-living project into our existing regulations, which doesn't necessarily create any, which allows for these types of projects to happen. But like I said, a co living project with 30 rooms is 1 unit. So the way that our code evaluates a project and talks about the impacts of 1 unit, this is just going to be the very largest unit of those units. But it's certainly something that we're looking at, again, as part of our housing element update.
Great, thank you. Another question about just the overall large number of RENA numbers, as well as just the size of the city. How much can our infrastructure hold? Plus, we've lost rent-controlled units to development. What will prevent more lost rent-controlled units and residents unable to afford moving, especially when rent-controlled units due to market rate increases aren't affordable to seniors or SSI?
Yeah, I think one important, legislative change that we didn't talk about is SB 330 came into effect January 1st of 2020. And the summary of it's called the Housing Crisis Act. And the summary is that it requires no net loss of units. So we cannot approve a project that would destroy rent stabilized units and not bring them back into the existing project. So if there's currently a fourplex on a site and a developer wants to put something new there, a minimum of 4 units have to be in the new project. And if those existing units are rent stabilized, the new project must also have rent stabilized units. So I think the shifts are coming down from the legislature, and we're doing our best. That's part of creating this housing element is not only do we need to create new housing, but we need to protect our existing naturally occurring affordable housing in order to avoid the effects that you mentioned. And we're very aware of that. And we're also very aware of our income restricted and senior households that really rely on us to do that work to protect that housing.
Great, thank you. Another question on more of infrastructure, less of housing. What's the latest on the subway and other ways for people to get around the denser city?
So the city has been working with Metro to push for the Purple Line extension that would go through the city of West Hollywood. Metro approved an EIR, an environmental impact report, to study the various options for rail going through the city of West Hollywood. So we're moving forward with that process faster than we thought we would. So the city's efforts to work with Metro have pushed that process forward to make this project potentially happen sooner. Obviously, we're still working on funding mechanisms for that with Metro themselves, but the city also launched a rail integration study to help understand how rail might actually work in the city and how it will look and what it could look like. So that study is underway, and we're hoping to keep that process moving and ultimately get ourselves a train in West Hollywood.
Great, thank you. There's also a question about a couple of people had submitted questions to the Zoom city clerk at weho.org, if we'll be able to answer those questions via the question and answer.
No, yeah. So we're, unlike a city council meeting, we're asking your Q&A to come directly into the chat or into the Q&A for us to review it during this time. If you have additional questions, after our last slide that we'll get to shortly is my contact info. We also, on the website, if you have comments or questions, you can leave them there and we will respond to them.
Yes, thank you. There is a question about the rent stabilization of buildings after 1979. I believe we've already answered that, so I'm going to dismiss that question. Does West Hollywood have any bridge housing planned?
So our strategic initiatives team has been working with the county. There's been funds made available to the various supervisorial districts. And so we are currently looking at sites in WeHo or very adjacent to WeHo, but nothing has been penned yet. We are aware of the need, and that team has been, kind of taking the lead on identifying a potential site for that critically needed, path between homelessness and housing.
Great. Okay. Sorry, we've got a couple of comments, just making sure we get them all. State housing laws now generally call for a 1-to-1 replacement of rent stabilized units when they are demolished and a new building constructed in their place. Exactly how is this replacement being addressed in West Hollywood?
Yeah, so when a project comes in for review, prior to it going to Planning Commission, I review the 1-for-1 replacement plans, and it's part of the presentation when it goes to Planning Commission to identify in that final report how it was assessed and what the replacement requirement will be.
A follow-up question on the climate change question. What about sustainability and resiliency, especially in relation to extensive dewatering that happens as a consequence of development due to the hydrology present in West Hollywood?
So each project basically evaluates that issue on a case-by-case basis. And we also are looking at that overall in our climate adaptation plan. And so that's something that we are working on and making sure that we address for every individual project and overall. But great question.
Great. This is one of our last questions, and it's technically two questions. So my neighborhood saw the demolition of 3 rent stabilized buildings with 21 apartment units on Norton Avenue near Creston Heights. What we got in return was about 30 high-priced apartments and only 5 units reserved for lower income folks. How will the housing element address this net loss of rent stabilized units so that it stops occurring?
As I said, SB 330, which came into effect January 1 of 2020, is partially, identifying this as an issue with no net loss. And in addition, maintaining that in our current code and expanding it will be part of the housing element, and it's part of our code. And then I think there's a second question about single family zoning.
Yes. Yeah. So the second question of how much of the 1.89 square miles of West Hollywood is zoned for single family / duplex homes, and how many people live on this land? How much of this area is zoned for apartment buildings and how many people live in those zones? Seems like apartment zones have been doing their fair share in providing housing units with land at premium, while the housing element and the task force explore upzoning of single family neighborhoods so that the properties are sold and they can be redeveloped for larger buildings with more housing units to meet the housing needs.
I believe there's also another question about zoning, upzoning rather. So maybe we can answer both of those at this time. Yeah. Rachel, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think the key is that all of these changes to zoning will come after the update to the housing element. So we'll look at all the policies, look at what our goals are, and then say, okay, how do we actually need to get here in a very detailed level? And what will we need to do in all zone districts? So we'll look at primarily first the zoning of the specific sites that we identify for a vast majority of that housing production, but then ultimately we will look at the zoning of our other zone districts. It's not anticipated that we are going to make major changes to our single family residential zone districts in terms of suddenly making them commercial or making them available for 20-story apartment buildings. That's not the type of transition that we're looking for, nor is it the type of transition that we'll actually need to accomplish our goals. Certainly, we do see a lot of pressure from the state to change not only state laws regarding single family zones, but then also would apply to us. But thus far, those have not happened, but we're constantly, working with the state to lobby and make sure that our voices are heard. I know we have a number of other questions and we can continue and go on forever, but we do need to end the meeting. But there are a number of questions that we will additionally answer and post on our website. If you have additional questions, we'd love to hear them. Please email us or reach out. Please visit our website to check in, and I'll turn it back over to Allison. But thank you so much for your participation today.
Yeah, thank you so much. As our last slide, Sarah, if you could put back up our PowerPoint. I'm going to have I'm the primary contact for the housing element update, and my information is great. So please take that down. Also, we just want to remind you that we did record this, and we will be posting the entire recording as well as the PowerPoint for your review at your own time, or to go back and look up. I know there's been some questions about stats and repeating things. And so again, this is available for you on our website, www.weho.org/housing element. So with that, we really thank you for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you. Please take the survey. It's available at www.weho.org/housing, and you can find out everything else you want to know about the process that thus far. And again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.